Hello, Somerville Borough Council. My name is Jeff Kaiser, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Somerville Environmental Commission. You are currently deliberating and reviewing the stormwater ordinance that the Planning Board gave to you. And the Environmental Commission wanted to take the opportunity to provide you with some additional amendments we'd like you to consider. You had decided to ask the Planning Board to consider our recommendations versus the state mandated requirements for stormwater under the Inland Flood Protection Rule of 2023. The Planning Board looked at a few of our recommendations and discussed them. During their deliberations, the state released a new set of mandatory stormwater regulations called the Real Rules and issued a new model ordinance the borough could use. When those came out, the Planning Board decided to recommend using the new state minimums, and they have given you the state's new model ordinance to consider, which I'll be referring to as the Real Rules. The topics I'm going to discuss and the amendments I'm going to suggest you incorporate into the stormwater ordinance were not thoroughly discussed in the Planning Board. Therefore, we believe it's important to speak about them now before you vote to adopt the state minimums. Also, it's very important to note that nothing I'm going to talk about here is associated with minor development and would be burdensome on Somerville's residential properties. We are recommending 4 amendments that only address major development and redevelopment. So we must start with the current state of our state's impervious coverage and the climate change we are experiencing. As you can see, New Jersey has had increased impervious coverage over the years, and this has led to increased stormwater runoff. Also, we are seeing, and we will continue to see, higher rainfalls and stronger storms due to the effects of climate change. And everything I'm going to discuss here is viewed through that lens. So let's get into it. These are the 4 recommendations I will be discussing. The first one is to address water runoff volume, the quantity of the water that's leaving a major development or redevelopment site. And we are going to be recommending that the site use feasible measures to control runoff volume and also close what's called the 5-year loophole, which I'll get into, which describes how an engineer would calculate the baseline peak runoff rate. The second one is to change the major development definition to include all impervious surfaces, not just motor vehicle surfaces. The third is water quality treatment. We would like to require the treatment of all impervious surfaces, not just parking lots, since most of New Jersey's waterways do not support aquatic life. And the fourth, if we're going to be implementing stormwater controls, it's important to make sure that they continue to work into the future. So we are suggesting some permitting and annual maintenance. So the first item I'm going to discuss is water quantity. And we will discuss the difference between water runoff rate versus water volume. The current ordinance that you are looking at, I'm going to be referring to as the real rules, the current state minimums. And TWI is going to be is related to the Watershed Institute's enhancements, which we took our recommendations from. And so we're going to discuss what's the difference between runoff rate and runoff volume. The real rules, the current ordinance you're looking at, deals with rate but not volume, while the Watershed Institute's recommendations and our recommendations deal with both. So this is the current state of the ordinances. I won't get into all the details here. You can see them and look at them as you wish. But 2 aspects I want to look at here. And one is the fact that the current proposed ordinance that you're looking at does not address impervious coverage of anything but the motor vehicle roadways, so parking lots and roadways. While we are recommending that we perform stormwater runoff calculations for all impervious surfaces during reconstruction of a site. and that we make sure we baseline the peak runoff rate of water from a site as if the site were completely permeable. The Real Rules does this, but only in conditions in which the site has been modified within the last 5 years. Most of our sites in Somerville that are going to be redeveloped have been sitting in the same condition, same hydrology for over 5 years. So let's take a look at a section of Somerville. This is the East Main Street business district that we're all familiar with. As you can see, the site's impervious coverage has not changed in 10 years. And so in this situation, an engineer could come to the site and use the current impervious conditions to baseline its peak runoff rate from. But under the Watershed Institute's recommendations, ours, the peak flow rate would have to be set and baselined as if the area of reconstruction was a permeable site, as if it was a forest. And this would result in a much lower runoff from the site. So I constructed some graphs to try to help you understand the differences between peak rate and volume runoff. Just because we control the peak rate of water runoff doesn't mean we actually control the amount of water coming off the site. As you can see, let's consider a 100-year storm. The blue graph shows what a storm would look like on the current site. The rain would fall, the rate of water would increase over time and then decrease as the storm stopped. Under the current ordinance, the peak rate would be baselined off of the current situation, since we're with a site that has no change over 5 years. So the peak rate for a 100-year storm would be set at 80% of the current hydrology. However, our recommendations would be baselined off of if the site was a permeable site. So the peak rate flow would be lower. Also, we're recommending that volume be controlled from the site. This would require feasible measures by the engineer to retain water on the site. As you can see, the shape of the orange graph is slightly different than the blue graph, even though the peak is less. And the green graph is lower and the shape is also different. So what does that mean for volume? What this means is that the current site has a certain amount of water that comes off of it. Under the current ordinance you're looking at, with a site that has not been changed in 5 years, the same volume of water would come off that site. Under our recommendations, because we lower the peak rate and we address water retention and address water volume, the amount of water coming off of that site is going to be much less. This means less water in our waterways. This means less water in our residents' basements and less water to destroy and harm our borough's infrastructure. This is how water volume can contribute, and peak flow rate doesn't necessarily deal with the overall problem. So let's deal with a scenario where the site has been changed in the past 5 years. Well, in that situation, you would set your peak rate flow the same as our recommendations. However, you can still see that that orange curve is getting squashed. The shape is changing. And that's because you're still not dealing with the water volume. You're not retaining water, you're just decreasing the speed at which it leaves the site. And so as you can see, the volume graph has not changed. You're still not addressing the amount of water coming off the site, where in TWI, you would address it. And this would lead to significant less runoff from a site due to its water retention requirements. So in conclusion, most sites in Somerville have not had their hydrology changed. The current ordinance you're looking at would make modest changes to the peak flow of the water, which would be a minimal, a modest benefit to your current ordinance. but it is the state minimum. Our recommendations ignores the timeline of the current site and also incorporates water retention to control the volume of water off that site. So what this results in is less water in our waterways, less water in our residents' basements, and less water to destroy and disrupt our town infrastructure and equipment. So another way to explain this is I'll use a different analogy that maybe is helpful. Think about a bucket that has a specific size hole in the bottom, and you're having a storm. That bucket is filling up with water, and depending on the size of the hole, you're having a certain amount of water leaving that bucket at a certain rate. That size of the hole is going to change based on the current ordinance. It will be set to 80% of the pre-development site. So you're going to have a certain size hole. All of that water is going to be moving off of an impermeable surface, if you consider the East Business District. And all of that water is going to eventually make it into our storm drains, into our stormwater management systems, and, like I said, into our rivers and streams. Even though it's flowing at a lower rate from the bucket than it would have been in the past, all of the water is going to get there. If you consider our recommendations, the same size hole in the bucket, if you consider a scenario that's less than 5 years of disturbance, the same amount of water is leaving the bucket. However, you are retaining some of that water on site, and not as much water will reach our stormwater management systems, our storm drains, and our residents' basements and such. So I hope this analogy helps you understand that a little bit better. The next recommendation we have is water quality. The real rules require a certain amount of suspended solids being removed or handled on motor vehicle ways, but other impervious surfaces are not addressed in the current ordinance you're looking at. Rooftops, plazas, loading areas, and sidewalks are not addressed. And I'd like to reiterate that most of the pollution that our waterways experience is from stormwater runoff. So currently, every major development has a runoff gap. The real rules require water quality treatment only for motor vehicle surfaces, parking lots, driveways, and roads, and none of these trigger any water quality standard no matter the size of the project. So this runoff affects our infrastructure. Like untreated rooftop and plaza runoff carries sediment, debris, and pollutants directly into Somerville's catch basins and storm drains, the same infrastructure that's already overwhelmed when it rains. The developer builds and then leaves. The borough maintains the system that receives everything they didn't treat. And so we close that gap. The enhancements we're recommending would require water treatment, quality treatment to all impervious surfaces, no matter the project, and with no new thresholds. Just a requirement that a developer is already designing a stormwater management into the site. Every hard surface gets treated, not just the parking lot. And you can look at West Windsor Township to get a better idea of how this might be implemented. The final recommendation we are going to be discussing is maintenance and permitting. So you can have great stormwater systems, you can have great green infrastructure that handles your stormwater runoff. You can implement stormwater runoff controls into a redevelopment site. However, they're only as good as they continue to be maintained. It's important to make sure that those systems work into the future. And so currently in the ordinance you're looking at, there's no follow-up requirement after construction. There's no mechanism to verify that they're actually working, and the borough doesn't have record of the facility's performance. In our recommendations, we would require annual maintenance permitting, inspection, and a maintenance report, and the borough would maintain the documents for all the facility's performance. And so this means like a rain garden that's installed and never maintained is not stormwater infrastructure. It's a landscaping feature. And we think that annual permitting would create some accountability. Also, clever note is that under FEMA's community rating system, stronger stormwater management programs can qualify Somerville residents for flood insurance premium discounts. So it actually could help the bottom line of our residents. So in conclusion, I'd like to also reiterate that all of these recommendations and amendments that we're offering are only based on major development and redevelopment. These are not based on minor development or anything that has any association with costs or burdens to homeowners. So we discussed runoff volume control. We think it's important to deal with the volume of water leaving our redevelopment and major development sites so that we can decrease and better manage the increased rainfall into the future as the climate continues to change. And this means less water in people's basements, less water in our waterways, less water to destroy our town infrastructure. And we think closing that 5-year loophole would greatly affect the town's stormwater management, since most of the sites in Somerville have not changed in the past 5 years, the large sites that are going to be redeveloped. New Jersey does not have many waterways that accept aquatic life. And stormwater is the major contributor to water quality in our waterways. We think it's important and that we address this in this ordinance and require that all impervious surfaces that are being created would treat for water quality. And also, all of these management systems are no good if they don't continue to work into the future. So a maintenance and permitting process we think is very important to maintaining our infrastructure into the future and making sure that we continue to be resilient against the increased rainfall and increased damage from storms. So I understand that your primary concern here is cost to our homeowners. However, as I said before, none of these recommendations would increase cost to the homeowner because they only address major development and redevelopment. And I'd like to make the case that inaction on these additional amendments would actually do just that. Inaction would actually increase the cost to our homeowners and our borough as well. Inaction would result in the very thing you are trying to protect. Then again, these amendments would likely increase the cost to the corporations or individuals developing in Somerville or in our redevelopment areas. And I understand that this can make you nervous and hesitant to adopt such measures, since that is one of your chief concerns as you work to shape Somerville into an even more vibrant borough. But I think it is prudent of you to weigh the costs of not adopting these 4 amendments. We ask that you weigh the implications of increasing the cost to developers versus increasing the cost to our homeowners and our borough, as our climate will continue to make storms more problematic into the future. Increased rainfall and stronger storms are going to result in damaged property in our residents' basements and damage to the borough's land and infrastructure. All of that costs money. So we simply ask you to consider the cost benefit of these amendments to the ordinance you are set to vote on. So we'd like you to consider adopting water runoff volume control, removing that 5-year loophole, making sure that it is based on forested baselines for rate calculations, addressing water quality, and also instituting some stormwater maintenance and permitting. Again, the Environmental Commission is always here to help you and to educate you and to help through this process, as there's a lot to discuss and this is a heavy topic. And there's also plenty of room between what we're recommending and what the state is requiring. And so we would welcome the chance to work with you directly and come up with some sort of other options if you would prefer. And I would just like to thank you for the opportunity to the chance to be heard before your vote is final. And so I wish you the best in your deliberations, and thank you so much for listening.